All right, welcome to Chapter 12 in Criminal Justice Today text. We're going to be looking at the prison experience and prison reentry, really two parts of the ending of our criminal justice system, the end approach, and a very important part of it, obviously, because we're focusing on really this is where we want the result of whatever prison is going to be accomplished. So we need to look at what's going on inside these prisons. Again, we're going to take a look at, of course, our learning objectives, the idea that total institution all the way through reentry programs, which is pretty much the second aspect of this. These are just general ideas to keep you focused on the main points in the chapters that we're seeking to accomplish. So let's move on to the first thing. So what are some questions to ask before you start studying this? Well, the first one I think is important to keep in mind, because you can't think of prisons as you start to study them as institutions that are complete in and of themselves. They are part of a larger structure, part of the larger structure of society. So anybody who goes into prison, there is an extremely high probability they're going to come out. Yes, we do have life prisoners. Yes, we do have people that we execute, but as a percentage of people that go to prison, it's a very small percentage. The second question is one I think that takes a little bit of a different mindset for people to appreciate, and that's, are prisoners still people? Now, obviously in a biological sense, they're still people, but in a civic sense, in the sense that people in the United States have rights, are they still people? And if you're saying, well, yes, but there's limits, okay. What rights do they keep? What rights do they lose? And why do they lose those rights? Which of those rights are taken for which reasons? The third question that we focus on is, why do people wind up going back to prison? Why are we dealing with recidivism? If we have these goals for prison, why do we have to keep repeating them over and over and over again? And the final one is more kind of general, is what are prisons like, not just for the inmates, but think about everybody associated with the prison. Visitors, victims, relatives of both victims, relatives of both prisoners, relatives of corrections officers. So think about how a prison, even though it could be said to exist for the prisoners, impacts all these people's lives around it. Okay, all organizations, all institutions have a culture associated with them. And this is the set of values that helps people in an organization understand what they can and what they can't do. And there can be conflicts in this. So as an example, the National Football League, the NFL, has an organizational culture. A while back, Count Kaepernick started to kneel during the national anthem. The culture of the institution was being challenged by an individual inside that institution. And of course, the institution initially acted in a particular way. They tried to, and ultimately did, ban kneeling during professional games. Now, fast forward to today, where the National Football League not too long ago announced that they were wrong to try to censor or change this. So institutions have these cultural attributes, but they are subject to change. Now, unlike most other institutes, prisoners can't leave these institutions. So these institutions become what we usually call a total institution. An institution that provides all the necessities for existence for those who live within its boundaries. Prisons, in fact, are one of the most extreme examples of that. You could look at monasteries. You could look at military units. Professional military units could be seen as total institutions. So when I say total institution, it's not necessarily a bad thing. It's just describing how an individual is so encapsulated inside of it that they get their values, they get their definition of their existence from that institution. Okay, prison culture. In part because it's a total institution. Total institutions have stronger cultures than minor things. You might belong to the Wake Tech Chess Club. It might have a culture around it, and it might have a way of behaving. Okay, you can come, you can go when you want. So it's not a total institution. It probably has a very minimal impact on you. On the other hand, prison has a very high impact on you because it's this total institution. The process whereby you are going to absorb the culture that surrounds prison is called prisonization. It is really just a kind of subcategorization of a larger process called socialization. Socialization is how you get culture. So again, we go back to our example of the chess club at Wake Tech. You know, if you saw how everybody behaved in the chess club and you saw how people talked, you will instinctively remain inside that group, adopt more and more of those attributes. Now, socialization, in the sense of prisons, we use the term prisonization. That's something that goes on when the prisoners, they come in as civilians, they come in as people that are not prisoners, and they are transformed into prisoners. And obviously the literal transformation takes place immediately when they walk in the door. But there is a process whereby they begin to change. So if I go and visit a client his first week in prison or jail, he's very much still kind of in civilian mode. By the time he's been in there 6 months or a year, he's very much in the prison mode. He's become an inmate or prisoner. So criminologists, people who study crime, in particular those that focus on prisons, study how prisoners change their behavior to adapt to life behind prison bars. So part of this can be picking up a language, or what's called an argot. So prisoners will speak in particular ways. They will walk in particular ways. They will talk in particular ways. And of course, eventually the physical manifestations are also followed by mental changes. So life behind bars will change an inmate. And now they don't all adapt the same way. There are some inmates that simply go in there and just say, I'm going to do my time. I'm just going to keep my head down. I'm going to do what I do. And then you've got other criminals who are trying to better themselves, improve themselves. You've got some criminals who are just there to exploit the situation. You know, there's a plethora, there's a number of different ways in which people adapt to prison. So all these different adaptations give rise to different values. Okay, so who's in prison? Now, obviously, there have been increases in the last 20, 30 years in minority populations and in women's population. But it is still primarily, if we look at gender, a male game. Somewhere between 80 and 90%, and it depends whether you include jails with your prisons and short and long term, and there's a number of things that can affect this, but somewhere between 80+% of the people in prison are men. And then if you look down racially, African Americans are overrepresented statistically, but whites, blacks, Hispanics are the three largest groups. There are some groups that are not well represented. We have seen an increase of prisoners convicted for drug offenses and immigration violations. So less violent offenders, although they will constitute the bulk of the prisoners incarcerated in states. Now, be a little bit careful of this, because there are some issues with classification what a violent offender is. For example, an illegal distribution of narcotics that leads to a death in North Carolina would be classified as a violent offender, second-degree murder generally. But if you think about it, if I sold drugs to you, would you consider me violent? But I might show up in the statistics if you died as a violent offender. So we do have to be a little bit careful about that. But still, state level, far more violent offenders. Okay, a couple of things to look at about the issues, some special issues. One is, our prisoners, like our society, is getting older. So we have, since we've decided to give prisoners very long sentences, 10, 15, 20 years, obviously if you put someone in jail and they're 30 when they commit a crime, they get a 20-year sentence and they're serving day for day, they're going to be out at 50. So we're having increasingly older populations. That is actually also being played out at the geriatric side, at the plus 65 side. So I was watching a documentary on Angola prison in Louisiana, and the warden has, Louisiana has very high incarceration rates and high levels, long sentences. So this warden is dealing with a significant number of prisoners who are now over 65 or 70. And of course, they have all sorts of special needs. They can't necessarily do the same things physically that you could expect of an inmate when he's 20 or 30 or 40. It's difficult for them to go upstairs. It's difficult for them to eat certain foods. They have different restrictions. They have higher medical, which brings up our next point. They're sicker. Medical costs are straining the correctional budgets across the United States. Now, let's discuss what we owe to people in jail in regards to medicine. The Supreme Court of the United States in Brown versus Plata said they have a constitutional right to adequate, not exceptional, not great, not every, but adequate health care. All right, well, what does that mean, and why is that increasing? Well, as for example, in our society, we're having a crisis with diabetes. Diabetes rates in the United States are skyrocketing, probably related in part to weight and diet, certainly related to those actually. It's important because diabetics, depending upon the stage of their diabetes, pre-diabetes, diabetes, diabetics require insulin. If you don't give it to them and they have a severe enough case of diabetes, they're going to die. So if you incarcerate a diabetic, you have to provide them with insulin. As the percentage of people in our society with diabetes has increased and has gotten younger, more and more of these diabetics will be in your jails and your prisons. And it's going to be our responsibility as the state to get them their insulin. They won't have jobs. They can't pay for it themselves. This means that the Wake County Jail, for example, has to spend a significant amount of money getting insulin. And if you know anything about the price of insulin in the last 20 years, it's skyrocketed. So you can have a significant percentage of the budgets of jails and prisons now going to medical costs for things like diabetes or treatment for hepatitis or a plethora of other diseases in our society. Final point here, mental illness. Most of our public mental hospitals, the big ones, began to close down in the 1970s. We went through a period of what was called deinstitutionalization, where we took most of the mentally ill who were in state mental institutions and we shut those institutions down with the promise or hope that we were going to open up smaller localized facilities or do more in-home treatment, and it frankly didn't happen. the percentage of mentally ill people in our society didn't change, might have gone up a little bit, but the percentage in mental institutions went down dramatically because we closed them. Those people had to go somewhere. All right, here's a couple charts to look at. This one is how we saw an explosion in, this is out of, by the way, the Bureau of Justice Statistics and published by the Pew Charitable Trust. You'll notice that the number of adults in prison over 55 went from, in 1990, just about 20 years ago, went from about 40,000. Today it's over 150,000. I know it's 164 and it was 43, but I'm just trying to give you quick numbers. And that's getting close to a 300% increase. So we are getting older in our prisons. All right, now rehabilitation, which can mean a lot of things in a lot of different ways. Rehabilitation are organized activities that we're hoping to change the inmate, improve his health, improve his mental skills, provide him with vocational skills, or just keep them busy. So what's the benefits of all this? Well, the benefits of all this, the benefits of all this, first of all, both for the inmates and the guards, is it alleviates the boredom that we see in jail and prison. Bored people can be very dangerous people. You know, one of the most dangerous ideas, the stupidest ideas we come up with typically are when someone says, I'm bored, and someone else says, well, I got an idea. The next thing it does is it helps inmates improve their health and their skill sets. Because remember, if you can give someone a job or a skill, and one of the reasons they maybe turned to crime was they lack those, then by providing them, you're going to give them an alternative when they get out of jail. Now, unfortunately, due to budgetary constraints, lots of prisons are limiting their rehabilitation and their treatment programs. So we're not doing as much actively inside prison as we used to. All right, prison violence. Prisons, jails are dangerous places. They're filled with younger adult males, which is the most violent part of our society. And some of the people in prison, and prison culture itself, is predicated on the ability and willingness to use violence. So why? Well, first of all, it establishes that hierarchy, that term we've heard throughout the semester. We've talked about hierarchies of court systems and hierarchies of police systems. People seem to naturally try to place themselves inside a structure, and prison is no exception. Violence can also be used so that you don't become a victim. So some people will act violently because they don't want to be violent, they'd be treated. It can enhance your self-image. In the case of rape, and this is something we'll talk a little bit more about in a moment, it can give a degree of sexual relief. It can also be used as a means of acquiring material goods, because there's few other ways of acquiring those goods. Why violence? Well, one of the things is you're living in an environment where most goods and services are not available. So it's called a deprivation environment. So inmates can feel very frustrated because they're deprived of their freedom, obviously, consumer goods, and simple things like cell phones or cigarettes or alcohol. They don't get sex, and other staples of life that are outside of the prison. Now, there is group violence inside prison as well, because not only do you have the formal structure of the prison, the wardens, the corrections officers, you have the informal structure inside the prisons. They're going to create power blocks. And sometimes these informal groups will result in riots, particularly if gangs are being formed. Researchers use the term relative deprivation to explain this larger group violence. Is when when you don't have those freedoms, when you don't have those services that we've come to accept as norm, or they're decreased dramatically, you can have violence. And this can happen even inside a prison, particularly when there's a change of administration and you have a new person come in who says, well, I'm going to change the availability of things. I'm going to shut down the library, or I'm going to limit yard time. That can lead to real problems, because those small little things might be all those inmates have. So what gangs do we see formed in prison? Well, I listed a couple there. The Mexican Mafia, Netia, Aryan Brotherhood, Black Guerrilla Family, La Nuestra Familia, the Texas Syndicate. That guy there who's tattooed with a pretty bad caricature of Hitler is a member of the Aryan Brotherhood, which is a white supremacist gang that does a tremendous amount of recruiting inside prison and behavior. So race and ethnicity form the major components of gangs in prisons. As if you went into Central Prison, or you went into almost any maximum security prison across the United States, one of the things you would notice is that the prisoners, even left to themselves, will self-segregate. And they'll even smaller self-segregation. So for example, yes, you'll see it break into Hispanic groups, black groups, white groups, but even inside those groups they will break even further. So in the Hispanic group you might, for example, have Mexican Americans who would not readily associate with Guatemalans, who might not associate with El Salvadorians. So all those groups can self-segregate. Race, as defined in prison, determines almost every aspect of your life. It's rare that you're going to see people crossing racial boundaries or cultural boundaries. It is very common that certain races or groups control specific jobs inside prisons, have specific cell locations. One of the things is it seems to help prisoners. It gives them a broader identity that they can identify. We also see gangs, and gangs provide this internal structure, these inmates who join together. The most dangerous thing, of course, ultimately for society is these gangs don't stay in prison. They're going to come out with us when we get out. So gangs are seen as security threat groups, or STGs. And as I said, racial and ethnic identification is the primary focus here of prison gangs. And prison gangs really are defined as inmates who band together and engage in social and sometimes criminal activities inside prisons and outside prisons. So prostitution, drugs, gambling, loaning money. Prison gangs are very important inside prisons. These STGs are considered really a threat, and we don't want them in our prisons. Now, different societies, interestingly, have different gangs that form and different long-term threats. So in the United States, our gangs, I guess you could kind of call them economic gangs. So it's not unusual that you have gangs that, as they get out of prison, are seeking economic profit. So selling drugs, loan sharking, gambling. It's pretty common for groups like the Crisps, the Bloods and the Crisps, or the Mexican groups, or the Aryan groups. On the other hand, if you contrast it with Europe, some of the most dangerous gangs in Europe are based on religious identity, which has an ethnic component to it as well. So many of the terrorist attacks that we've seen in Europe, the Berlin Christmas attack, the truck attack in Paris not too long ago, many of those people seem to have histories inside prisons where they became radicalized religiously. Now, we don't see a lot of that in American prisons. We saw some of it in the 60s, but we don't tend to see it. 30% of males and 9% of females will join a prison gang. And the prison administration has to be aware of STGs. it has to take steps to keep them from getting too powerful, which can be very difficult. So again, we'll talk about that difference in gangs, but I wanted to introduce it. We'll look at that in micro lecture 12.1. All right, let's talk a little bit, because remember, these are total institutions. We've talked a lot about the inmates. Well, let's talk about the corrections officers. Again, like probation officers, one of the unsung heroes of our system. So what is it like? Well, first of all, it has very steady employment and very secure job prospects. It is not considered a prestigious job. It's not something you hear. I mean, you do hear kids growing up say, I want to be a fireman, or I want to be a police officer, or I want to be a lawyer. But very few people say, I want to be a correction officer, Daddy. It's still a vital job. Now, lately standards have been rising, and if you want to be a corrections officer, there's a civil service exam. Very often there's military-style training. There's a degree of classwork and physical work that goes with it. However, to be fair, it's certainly not as high as if you wanted to be a police officer, or as high as if you want to be a lawyer. It is a paramilitary structure, so you're going to have your regular corrections officers, and your next level is going to be your sergeants, and your next level is lieutenants and captains. So it's a paramilitary or military structure. So the different jobs you could have, if you're inside the prisons, you could have a block officer, work detail, yard guards, tower guards, industrial shop and school officers. All these are different things you can perform, and this is not an exhausted list. Central Prison, for example, has a 144-bed hospital, so you could be assigned internally as part of the medical unit. So there's a ton of different jobs. All right, inmate discipline. The three primary goals here. You're going to ensure a safe and orderly living environment. Safe for the prisoners, safe for the corrections officers. Want to instill respect for authority of the correction officer administration, or authorité if you're a South Park fan. You want to teach values and respectful behavior that will influence you as you get out. So in other words, you want to, and this is the most difficult one, and often one that is ignored because the other two, we spend so much resources and effort with them, is we want to change the person so that when they get out, they have learned different values. It's hard to teach people these different values. Now, we have to sanction prisoners or punish them. So inmates are made aware of what the rules of prisons are, and they should be made aware of what the punishments are, and those rules have to be enforced by corrections officers. And this is the most difficult, the most stressful part of their jobs. Punishments range all the way from loss of privileges, like you can't go to the cantina, you can't you can't play your radio band certain times, you can't get cigarettes, to solitary confinement, to really stressful solitary confinement. Sometimes you have to use force. Use of force is approved inside prisons if there's a legitimate security interest. So if a corrections officer uses force and he was acting in self-defense, that's fine. Acting to defend the safety of a third party. Upholding the rules of the institution, preventing crime, preventing escape. All those are acceptable exercises of force. Now, there is a limit beyond which they can't go. Corrections officers may not behave in a malicious or sadistic way. So we call this the malicious or sadistic standard. So we look at what were they doing and why. So if they're trying to prevent a murder inside prison, they have a great deal of power to use almost on a limited level of force. If they're trying to prevent someone from smoking a cigarette in their cell, that's a lesser offense, and the amount of force they should be able to use there is lower. So it's kind of a sliding scale. It's not just a question of how much force was used, but was it in good faith? Was it proportional? All right, a little bit about female corrections officers. For many years, we didn't see women hired as corrections officers inside prisons. There was kind of the belief that women were unsuited for it. That's changed, in part because of several court cases, in part because of the necessity to try to find people that will work in our prisons. Today, we have more than 150,000 female corrections officers or officers who work in prison in some way, shape, or form. And we haven't had a lot of problems with them. There is an obvious problem here that should be addressed, and that's sex. The primary perceived problem, at least, caused by women working in male prisons is sexual misconduct. That the female corrections officers are either victimized by the inmates or they exploit the inmates. Now, it certainly happens. Guards will have sex with inmates. Female guards will have sex with male inmates. They'll also have sex with female inmates, but the same thing is true of male corrections officers. We don't see rates that are significantly higher. We don't see problems that are significantly greater. So this remains a significant problem across the board. All right, so what rights do prisoners have? The 13th Amendment, the Civil War amendments, the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendment that abolished slavery, really indicated that you can kind of still treat people who have lost their liberty because of a crime with fewer rights. So inmates are not, under the 13th Amendment rights, you're not guaranteed the same rights as other Americans. And traditionally, the courts had adopted what was called the hands-off doctrine. In some ways, this was a civil death. When you went to jail or prison, society treated you like you were dead. You were in this other place. You didn't have the same rights. We didn't want to know what was going on. And really, through the 1920s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, into the 70s, this kind of went along. But as more and more stories and more appreciation came out of just how bad American prisons were and how they weren't working and how they were becoming more and more expensive, the Supreme Court stepped in and said, no, there's going to have to be some balancing act. We're going to have to get rid of the hands-off doctrine. The standard today, basically, we need to look at what fundamental rights remain for prisoners, like we talked about one earlier about right to basic medical care, and what are the security needs of the institution. So balancing those two, always favoring security. Are they human? Are they citizens? And this goes back to our micro lecture 12.2. Citizens have constitutional rights. Prisoners exist somewhere between are you a citizen and do you have nothing? So we're going to look at, in lecture 12.2, the approach about prisoners. Okay, now the 8th Amendment of the Constitution of the United States bans cruel and unusual punishment. So there are a couple standards used for determining if there's been a violation here. We look at, and this came out of the case of Estelle versus Gamble in 1976, was the prison administration deliberately indifferent? This can be difficult to define, but deliberate indifference. Prisoners show that the prison, people that run the prison, were aware there were harmful conditions and didn't take any steps. So they knew there was a problem and didn't react to it. Now this was refined somewhat under what's called the Identifiable Human Needs Standard. This came out of a Wilson case in 1991. If you can show you were denied basic human necessities, food, warmth, shelter, exercise, that can be a violation. And these cases were not popular when they came down. People in the United States tend to think that prisoners should get nothing. You do have to remember this, and when I approach this, I like to tell my students, you can make prisons hellholes. But what you're doing in part is you are going to punish the prisoners, you're going to punish the guards as well. because at a certain point, those prisons will explode, and people will die, and some of those people that will die will be your corrections officers. The worse you make the prisons, the worse you make the prisoners. The worse the prisoners become, the more they will act up. All right, some issues with female prisoners to address some of their issues. Female prisoners often lack a degree of efficacy. They tend to have a degree of parental stress. We're going to talk about children in prison in a moment. They tend to suffer from more mental health problems than their male inmates, which is high enough already. They tend to be victims of physical and or sexual abuse. They tend to have unhealthy relationships outside. They tend to have high levels of poverty and homelessness. So that's a pretty grim list to look at. They don't seem to be able to come out and defend themselves as much. They have all these stresses. They, fortunately for us, are a small percentage of the prison population comparatively, but they have a lot of issues. So here's some breakdowns. If we look at ethnicity and age, again, whites are the single largest component. African Americans are about 20%, so about twice as likely as in the general population. Hispanics about 17%, others, which would include Native Americans and those that are biracial. If we look at age, you'll notice that it really is pretty evenly divided between the 20s up to age 50. And then we have that group age 50 plus, which is increasing dramatically. So, interesting charts, I thought. What are some special problems? Well, here's one we don't think about. Motherhood. If we go back to this previous chart for 1 second, you'll notice, you'll notice that there's a lot of women between the ages of 20 and 29 and 30 and 39. They constitute more than half of the population in prisons. Well, that's prime childbearing years. 7 out of every 10 female prisoners has a minor child. So this creates a big problem. If you throw a woman in prison and she does not have anyone to take care of the children, well, guess what? We can now add that in as a cost of that incarceration. What are you going to do with them? They're going to have to go into foster care. They're going to have to go into some sort of, even maybe an institution, an orphanage, although we don't tend to run those much anymore. Inmates often are housed great distances from their children, and the cost of staying in touch can be quite high. And again, it's costs both directly to them and indirectly to the system. The other thing, if you go to a women's prison, it's a different vibe. So if we talk about the culture, women's prisons, you walk into them, and maybe, of course, it's because I'm a man and because I've just been culturally trained not to fear or have a relationship with women like that. But you just are not as afraid when you walk in a women's prison. And women's prisons, there's lower levels of gang-type violence. But there is sexual victimization. We do tend to see that. Women in prison tend to form family groups, or what we call pseudo, which is Latin for false, pseudo families, in which inmates play very specific roles. So very often there's a younger inmate who relies upon an older female inmate who forms kind of the mother in the relationship, seeking emotional support and companionship. It's a very, very common structure. We see it repeated over and over again in our prisons. Okay, when inmates get pregnant. Okay, women in prisons and jails in 2017 who were pregnant when admitted. So 3% of those in federal prison, 4% of those in state prison, 5% of those in jail. And you're probably saying, well, why is this important? Well, again, let's look at one aspect of this: cost. If you're running a jail and you admit a pregnant woman and she says, you know, I have gestational diabetes, or I have you know, I have specific vitamins I have to take, or you know, I've got health issues related to the pregnancy. This is going to be expensive. And then when they give birth, where are they going to give birth? You know, if they're having a difficult problem, if they need a cesarean, you know, you can't do that in the jail. So again, you're going to have to pay attention to this if you are running a prison or a jail. This is going to be 1 out of 20 of your jail in people admitted. All right, moving off of women for a second and talking about reentry to society. Each year, about 700, 600,000 inmates are released from American prisons. And the problem is going to be, how can we keep them from coming back into the system? How can we keep them from returning? So there are different types of release. There's parole. There is maxing out. You served your sentence. There's pardons, which are really rare. There's furloughs, which are temporary release, which don't tend to exist for minor crimes. But those are all different types of release. So big problems for reentry. What can we do to give the prisoner on the outside a chance not to wind up back on the inside? So one of the things we are increasingly doing is transitioning. We're not just saying, all right, walk out the door, you're done, goodbye. We're looking at a range of support when they're getting out, things like halfway houses, even serving a little bit of their sentence outside in these halfway houses. You have to realize that prisoners can come out of jail after 5 or 10 or sometimes 20 years, and now they have to deal with economic, technological, social changes. So if you went into prison in the year 2000, yes, there were smartphones. There weren't smartphones, I'd say, but yes, there were mobile phones, but nowhere near as integrated to society as today. So an inmate coming out has to adjust to that type of culture. He has to adjust to what jobs exist, what jobs don't exist. You know, he might have had a job at Blockbuster Video before he went in. Well, there's no Blockbuster videos. So society has changed, and he or she has to be able to change. There can be issues with transportation. There can be issues with employment. There can be issues with age and mental illness. All of these are significant barriers. And then there's a problem of, how much do you want to help the prisoners? I mean, they've screwed up. Do you want to help them, or do other people in society that haven't screwed up have more of a claim on our resources to help them? Do you help a person who's never committed a crime get his GED, or do you help a prisoner get his GED? One of the things we want to do is we want to break the prison cycle. We want to, and we know that the longer we can keep them from committing a crime, the less likely they wind up back in prison. So we want to help them have a positive reentry, and we want to provide the most support we can, particularly early on, so that we're not dealing with them again. This preparation starts while they're still in prison. Now, we can also look at a more community-based approach. If they're having all these significant issues, maybe we want to look at, I mentioned these before, things like halfway houses. Let's reintegrate them slowly to society. Maybe we want to give them the option, particularly for nonviolent crimes, to expunge or get rid of the requirement that they tell everybody that they were even arrested for a crime. Maybe if it's unrelated to their job, they don't have to disclose it. So we're looking at ways in which they can truly get a chance to start over in the society. All right, a few ideas about special conditions, sexual offenders. This has been the focus. I would say it's not as much as it was even 5 or 10 years ago, but this was the focus, the idea of sexual predators, The idea particularly of really heinous criminals like child molesters. What do you do when you let a child molester out? Because your greatest fear is, okay, he served a 5 or 10-year sentence. And I say he because most of these are men. He served a 5 or 10-year sentence. What can we do, of course, going forward to make sure that he doesn't wind up back in here, which means he doesn't assault another child? So we very often will give them special conditions on release, like they can't have contact with children. They can't be living near children. They can't have a job near children. So they can't be, say, a janitor in a school or run an ice cream parlor. They can't, they can't live next to a school. They can't even live with children. We also want to give them mental health treatment. We want to monitor them, see if they are, if they had been on medication that lowered their libido, their sexual desire, we want to make sure that they're continuing on that. If they are undergoing therapy, we want to make sure they're still in that therapy so they're not out harming or raping children. I included this, not because I know this guy, this chart, but if you go to the North Carolina Sex Offender Registry and you put in an address, and I just put in a randomized address here, you'll notice that each one of these little kind of triangular, I guess it's a I guess it's a pentagon, but it's not equal sides. So it looks like an upside down house to me. But if you look at each one of these little things, those are sex offenders living within that zone. In North Carolina, you have to register where you're living. So you can do this yourself if you want. You can go to North Carolina Sex Offender Registry. You can put in your address, and then it'll bring up a chart within this radius. These are the number of sex offenders that live there. This is over near Triangle Town Center. This is important because it tells us where they're living. Is it near a church? Is it near a school? Suppose you had a sex offender too that had molested children or assaulted children in a particular way. So they, I don't know, make up a bizarre way so it's an easy scenario. They dressed up in a clown costume before they did it, a la It, the movie. Okay, well, let's suppose you had a similar assault in this area in Raleigh. Well, you would, as a police officer, be able to call up this map, scroll through those names, come across someone, and I'm not saying it's Alex, Adrian, Martin, but you'd be able to call up someone that might say, okay, this is a guy living near this assault that occurred that also dressed up like a clown. Let's go visit him. Many states have sex offender registries, and the public is allowed to search these for sex offenders who've been released and live near them. And they have to register, and they have to update their information as they move jobs and or residencies. All right, on that note, we're right about 50 minutes where I want to be. We've got 2 more chapters in our text to look at. Other than that, have a good evening.